Hello everyone, it's me, Giles with a J, the person who personally narrates this channel. Just remember, that will never change. We're on season 21 and the theme is strange and unusual, so if you have any suggestions that fit that theme, leave them in the comments. Otherwise, if you enjoy the show, slap that subscribe button, uppercut the like button, and turn on notifications. I post new episodes twice a week, a long episode every Monday and a shorter episode every Thursday. Now, on to the show. On the evening of February 21st, 1977, emergency services were called to an apartment fire on Chicago's North Side. Firefighters were directed to one of the top floor units where thick black smoke was seeping out from under the door. The building manager met them there with a key, but the lock wouldn't turn easily. He kept trying while the smoke got worse, filling the hallway and making it hard to breathe. When the door finally opened, visibility inside the apartment was almost zero. Firefighters crawled along the floor towards the windows and managed to break a few panes of glass to let some of the smoke escape. With a better view of the apartment, they could see that the source of the fire was the bedroom. A mattress was propped up against the wall and a pile of clothes underneath it was fully engulfed. When the flames were extinguished, one of the crew poked through the pile to make sure no embers remained. When he hit something solid, he moved some of the clothes aside and found a body. The woman was naked and badly burnt, but that wasn't what stood out. Right in the middle of her chest was a large knife embedded to the hilt. The fire was a cover for murder. This is Monsters. The woman found stabbed and burned to death in her own bedroom was the apartment's sole occupant, Teresita Basa. Teresita was born on March 13, 1929 in Dumaguete City in Negros Island in the Philippines. At the time, Dumaguete was about as far from the busy urban centers of Manila or Cebu as you could get. It was a quiet coastal area surrounded by sugarcane fields and thick coconut groves and the kind of place where life moved slowly. Dumaguete was only moderately developed. Before the roads were paved, dusty paths and muddy tracks crisscrossed the town. The main mode of transport, aside from walking or cycling, was horse-drawn carts which were known in the local dialect as tartanillas. Life on the island was simple but rich in community. Teresita's parents, Pedro Basa and Socorro Martinez, were members of the Dumaguete aristocracy. Pedro worked as a lawyer representing local sugar plantations as they took their product to the international market, while Socorro was a music teacher at the local university. Teresita was an only child, but her parents' place in society meant she was always around other adults and their children, and she was never short of company. The Basa family lived in an upmarket home complete with ornate mahogany trim, cathedral windows, and a tiled roof which reflected the influence of Spanish colonial architecture in the Philippines. Socorro took pride in cultivating an impressive tropical garden at their home. She grew orchids, baono trees, coconut palms, poinsettias, hibiscus, banana plants, and bougainvilleas which flourished in the warm climate. Teresita was known as Cheetah to her parents and friends, and she was given every opportunity to succeed in life. Her parents' wealth and place in society meant she was able to follow any path she desired in life, and she chose a path which revolved around music. Teresita took after her mother as a gifted pianist. She could play almost before she could walk and talk. By age 7, she was receiving formal piano training, and her parents shipped a Steinway grand piano to the island to advance her talents. Socorro was a renowned coloratura soprano, and together the pair filled the family's home with music. When Teresita wasn't studying music or going to school, she took every opportunity to watch local performances at the town plaza, which was located just across the road from her house. She loved anything with a rhythm, from jazz to traditional Filipino music and opera. Chita's life was about as idyllic as you could imagine. She had loving parents, a comfortable home life, natural talent, and the rare privilege of being able to follow her dreams. But that sense of safety and stability was destroyed in December of 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Since 1848, the Philippines had been under American control, following Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War. The Treaty of Paris transferred sovereignty from Spain to the United States, which made the archipelago an American colony. Naturally, Filipinos who had been fighting for independence from Spain resisted their new controller. That led to the brutal Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902. Thousands of Filipino fighters and civilians died, and eventually the U.S. agreed to establish a civilian government. They built schools and infrastructure, but they never truly relinquished control. All school-aged children were forced to learn English and pledge allegiance to the American flag. Locals continued to pursue independence, and in 1935, the Philippines was granted Commonwealth status along with the promise of full independence in 1946. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Philippines was dragged into the Second World War. As a U.S. territory and their location in the Pacific making them a strategic stronghold, Japanese forces turned their attention to the islands. Over the coming years, the island country became the site of fierce battles and devastating losses. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese planes began bombing military bases in the Philippines. Manila was declared an open city to avoid destruction, but Japanese forces occupied it anyway. Despite being under American control with American military bases scattered across the country, the Philippines was unprepared for war, and they were no match for the might of the Japanese. Filipino and American troops fought side by side in the Battle of Bataan and the Battle of Corregidor, but in 1942 the country had fallen under Japanese control. What followed was a brutal occupation which included the Bataan Death March, where thousands of prisoners of war died from exhaustion, starvation, and abuse. Despite the odds being stacked against them, Filipino guerrilla groups resisted Japanese rule across the islands. By 1945, Allied forces returned to liberate the country, and a year after the war ended, the Philippines were granted independence from the U.S. as promised. Teresita was just 12 years old when the war destroyed her homeland. Although Dumaguete was somewhat removed from the devastation and battles in the major cities, the residents still had to abide by the Japanese rule of law. Japanese troops occupied the island, and English classes were replaced with compulsory Japanese. Young girls from the city were also forced into sex work to support their families, while the men were shipped off to fight in a war they wanted no part of. One of the most defining moments of Teresita's young life was when she watched an American P-38 fighter aircraft being shot out of the sky by Japanese forces. The pilot was able to eject moments before the plane hit the ground, and he deployed his parachute. He landed safely in the plaza across the road from the Basa's house, but within seconds the plaza was surrounded by Japanese troops. The family watched as the soldiers approached the pilot. Pedro reassured Teresita that they would take the man as a prisoner of war, but instead the 20 soldiers took turns shooting him and then stabbing him with their bayonets. Pedro and Socorro tried to rush Teresita away before she could watch it happen, but the damage was done. It was a brutal introduction to violence, and one that would plague Teresita's thoughts for the rest of her life. When the fighting stopped in 1945 and the Philippines gained independence a year later, the impact of war was scarred onto the hearts of every Filipino, Teresita included. The glow of her idyllic childhood had long since tarnished, and Teresita found herself traumatized by her memories every time she looked out onto the plaza. So when she finished high school, she told her parents she didn't want to stay in Dumaguete to study. Instead, she wanted to move to Manila to study music at the St. Scholastica College. Her parents were hesitant about her decision. The capital was far away, chaotic, and still reeling from the devastation of war. But eventually they agreed when their close family friends invited Teresita to live with them while she was studying. The Romeros were also from Dumaguete, and the families had known each other for years. The patriarch, Jose Romero, was a respected figure in Philippine politics and a member of the House of Representatives. One of their daughters, Tessie, was similar in age to Teresita, and the pair were best friends. Once she was settled in Manila, Teresita threw herself into her studies. She learned Tagalog fluently and worked to refine her English, which had been stunted during the years of Japanese rule. She explored the city, spent time with her friends, and every time the Manila Symphony Orchestra performed, she was there. In 1952, Teresita graduated from university with honors. By then, Jose Romero had been appointed as the government representative in London, and Teresita spent the last year of her studies living alone in the big city. When college was over, she returned to Dumaguete, and her parents encouraged her to take up a position as a music teacher at the local university, alongside her mother. But Teresita had bigger dreams. She told her parents she wanted to visit London. They read between the lines of her request and could see she not only wanted to visit London, she wanted to live there. In 1951, Teresita landed in England, where she enrolled to study pianoforte at the Royal College and moved back in with the Romeros. It was a long way from the quiet streets of Dumaguete, but Teresita adapted quickly. She found herself surrounded by artists, composers, and musicians from all over the globe, and just like she had in Manila, Teresita took every opportunity to explore the city. She visited Kensington Gardens, Hyde Park, Buckingham Palace, and Westminster Abbey to watch concerts at Albert Hall. It was in the hushed stillness of the famous abbey that Teresita had her first brush with the occult. As she stood surrounded by towering stone columns and the burial vaults of long-dead kings and queens, she felt something stir. She later told a friend that she sensed the ghosts of the past were whispering to her. She said, quote, "It's like when you're with someone close and you don't need words. You're communicating without speaking. I was frightened, but I didn't want to leave. It was as though the dead were calling to me." The experience didn't seem to put Teresita off visiting more cathedrals and burial grounds. If anything, it sparked quite a fascination in her. She felt the same way when she got lost in her music, as if otherworldly forces were being channeled through the keys of her piano. But her most unforgettable experience in London came a few months later when Jose Romero announced that he had been invited to a reception at Buckingham Palace, and the headline attendee at the event was the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II. Jose was allowed to bring any unmarried daughters over the age of 18. Jose counted Teresita as one of his own, and so both girls were able to attend the reception alongside him. The girls wore balintuoks, which are traditional Filipino dresses with butterfly sleeves. As they awaited the arrival of Her Majesty, the attendees were instructed on the proper way to address the Queen if she chose to acknowledge them. The girls were taught how to curtsy and reminded to speak only if spoken to. They stood in quiet anticipation as Queen Elizabeth swept gracefully through the room, pausing briefly with a chosen few. And then the young queen stopped in front of Teresita. Despite her nerves, Teresita dropped into a curtsy. The queen offered a small smile and complimented Teresita's name and asked her about her studies. Then she continued on. The whole interaction was over in less than 30 seconds, but those few words stayed with Teresita for the rest of her life. Afterwards, she told her parents how she couldn't believe that the queen was, quote, "just a girl like me." Queen Elizabeth and Teresita were just 3 years apart in age. Over the next few years, while Teresita continued her studies, she visited Vienna to see Beethoven's birthplace in the hall where Mozart had once played. All throughout her travels, she continued to have the sense that the dead were speaking to her, and sometimes that they were playing music only she could hear. The feeling only deepened when she went to Paris for the first time and met the famed Russian composer Alexander Scherepnin. After the pair spoke at a reception and he learned about her music studies, Alexander invited Teresita to play for him and his family. He was impressed by her talent, and they spent hours talking about music and its influence on their lives. When Teresita asked where Alexander got the inspiration for his compositions, he revealed that they were less his own doing and more the work of ghosts and spirits that communicated with him when he was playing music. He explained, quote, "When I write music, I go into another world. Thousands of vibrations surround me and strange things come to life for me and I put them into my music. When I am so occupied, people fear to disturb me. They tell me that the look on my face when I return to reality is absolutely frightening. Can you understand what I'm talking about?" It was the first time Teresita had heard someone articulate the connection between what she had felt in the Abbey and music. The way Alexander spoke of vibrations and slipping into another world mirrored the eerie familiarity she felt among the tombs at Westminster Abbey and at Beethoven's birthplace in Mozart's Hall. The revelation was both unsettling and strangely comforting. When Teresita was due to return to London, Alexander encouraged her to consider moving to the U.S. to complete her master's at Chicago University, where he taught for part of the year. She had never considered traveling to the U.S., let alone living or studying there, especially given its long and painful history of occupying the Philippines. But Alexander's words stuck with her. After finishing her studies in London, Teresita returned to Dumaguete. She relished the familiar comforts of home, but she also found herself considering what life would be like in the U.S. It didn't take her long to make up her mind. In the summer of 1957, Teresita traveled to Bloomington and enrolled at Indiana University under the Foreign Exchange Visitors Program. She rented her own apartment for the first time and learned how to navigate the American way of life. She easily made new friends at school and connected with a group of fellow Filipinos who were also studying music. She maintained a 3.5 GPA and earned a bachelor's degree with honors in both music and piano. All in all, Teresita completed an impressive 58 courses during her time at university. And after graduation she was offered a job teaching undergraduate piano. But within a few months she was on the move again. Jose Romero had been appointed the Washington representative of the Philippine Sugar Association, and the family invited her to join them once again. By then her best friend Tessie had gotten married and moved in with her husband. Up until that point in Teresita's life, love had been far from her mind. She preferred to study, play music, and spend time with her friends. But that all changed in Washington. After Jose hosted a diplomatic reception and asked Teresita to entertain their guests on the piano for the evening, she was introduced to Ed O'Meara. He called himself a lobbyist for Illinois industry, and he boasted that he knew, quote, "a lot of very influential people, and I'm not without influence myself." During their first official date, Teresita told Ed that she was in the U.S. on the student exchange program. That meant that if she wanted to apply for residency so they could be together, she would need to return to the Philippines for at least 2 years. Plus, as a devout Catholic, she needed to seek guidance from her parents before she could commit to a relationship with him. Ed would either need to wait for her to return or join her in her homeland. The situation didn't seem to put him off. He professed his love and promised he would faithfully await her return. Within a month, Teresita had packed up everything she owned and flew home to live with her parents until she was eligible to move back to the U.S. permanently. When she arrived home, she told Pedro and Socorro that she had fallen in love and wanted to get married. Her parents were overjoyed at Teresita's news. She was 36 years old, and they had feared that she would never find a soulmate or start a family of her own. A couple of months after arriving back in Dumaguete, Ed surprised Teresita by flying to the island to see her. He told her he wanted to do right by her parents and asked their permission to court their daughter and eventually marry her when she was able to return to the States. Pedro and Socorro were thrilled that Ed respected them enough to fly over to meet them in person. He was exactly the kind of person they pictured their daughter spending their life with. He was kind, gentle, and successful, and he promised that Teresita would never want for anything. One night, while Ed was in Dumaguete, he left Teresita and Socorro playing and singing on the piano while he went for a walk just like he did most evenings. Mother and daughter were incredibly close, and Ed said it was important for them to have uninterrupted time together. An hour later, a local man came running towards the house and knocked on the door. Socorro answered, but the man asked to speak to Pedro and only Pedro. A few minutes later, the men left together without any explanation. When Pedro returned that night, he had devastating news. The man had taken Pedro into town to the local brothel. Just inside the door, he found Ed in a rather compromising position with a young woman. It turned out that Ed made a point of leaving Socorro and Teresita alone each night so he could find some company of his own. When Ed returned to the Basas after completing his extracurricular activities, he found his belongings piled on the side of the road. Teresita never saw or spoke to him again. Ed was her first and last love interest. Word of what he had done spread through Dumaguete like wildfire, and for months, Teresita refused to show her face in town. The shame and embarrassment of the situation closed her heart to romance, and she spent the rest of her life focused on the only type of love that had never let her down: music. Over the coming years, Pedro's health deteriorated and Teresita stayed by his side, nursing him through the last months of his life. By then, everyone assumed she would stay on the island for good, perhaps to be a music teacher like her mother. But Teresita had kept in touch with the composer she met in Paris, Alexander Cherepnin. He never stopped encouraging her to complete her master's degree, so in 1971, Teresita did exactly that. At age 42, she packed up her life once more and flew to Chicago. Starting over once again, she signed a lease for a tiny apartment, and after sorting out her residency, she secured a job as a typist. But Teresita was different from the carefree young woman who had been so excited to explore every new city in the past. She was cautious about who she spent time with, and for the first year in Chicago, she rarely left the house except to go to work and buy supplies. It was only after a coworker encouraged her to get out and explore the city that she decided to finally let her walls down. After that, there was no stopping Teresita. She made it her mission to see a new corner of the city every weekend, and she connected with two distant cousins who lived in Chicago. They showed her around and put her in touch with a local Filipino expat group. Little by little, she felt more like Chicago was her home rather than a place she was just visiting. Despite her expanding social circle, Teresita was still guarded and protective of her space. She loved to entertain, but she never opened the door to a stranger. And while she always kept beer in the fridge for her guests, she never drank with them in case she lost control of the situation. After a year in Chicago, she was ready to start studying again. But rather than choosing a music course, she decided to try something that would give her better job prospects. She knew she could always do music on the side, but her first priority was to pay her way and have enough money left over to explore Chicago. In 1972, Teresita enrolled at the YMCA Community College to study respiratory therapy. She kept her typist job and studied in every spare minute she could find. 2 years later, she graduated top of her class and was given a full-time job as an inhalation therapist at Edgewater Hospital. That seemingly small milestone was a turning point in Teresita's life, but not the good kind. Instead, her job at the hospital became the conduit which led her directly into the path of a monster. With a respectable salary of $11,000 a year, Teresita was able to afford a bigger apartment, and for the first time since she returned to the U.S., she had enough room for a piano. As Teresita's life blossomed, she wrote to her mother each week to share her achievements and the friends she was making along the way. She wrote about how she and her cousin had formed a 6-piece band and they were booked nearly every weekend to perform at events across Chicago, and how at work she was commended as a diligent and reliable employee. She was always on time, never called in sick, and she was the first to put her hand up to help. Socorro loved hearing about Teresita's adventures, and she was desperate to visit. In 1976, she traveled to America to stay with her daughter and see her new life firsthand. Socorro watched as her daughter played with the band and entertained her friends at her cozy apartment. Teresita also took her mother on a bus tour of the city she had adopted as home. For the first time in a long time, Socorro felt comfortable in knowing her daughter was happy and safe. On the day she left Chicago to return home, Socorro sat Teresita down and handed over 2 pieces of jewelry. The first was a pearl ring she had bought on a trip to Paris 20 years earlier, and the second was a hand-polished piece of jade Pedro had given her when they were young. As she handed them over to her daughter, she told her it would bring her comfort to know that even though oceans separated them, they were connected by these precious items. Little did either of them know how significant these items would come to be, or that it was the last time they would see each other. Less than 6 months after Socorro's visit, Teresita's body was found stabbed to death under a burning mattress in her own bedroom. The autopsy revealed that Teresita had died no more than an hour before the fire was started, and likely within just 30 minutes of the flames being reported. Her cause of death was the knife wound which had punctured her heart and killed her almost instantly. But one unusual detail stood out more than anything else. Despite being found naked and with her legs spread, there were no signs of sexual assault. With that information, investigators believed the scene had been staged to make it look like her murder was sexually motivated and to conceal whatever the true motive was. But that motive was unclear. The apartment was messy, but not ransacked. Her purse was on the floor, and although her jewelry box looked like it had been disturbed, it was still full. Every surface in the apartment was carefully dusted for fingerprints. In the kitchen, there were signs that Teresita had been preparing a meal before her death. Half-chopped vegetables were still on the counter, and the only knife missing from the block was the one now embedded in her chest. Investigators found several empty beer cans in the trash, which were collected and dusted for prints as well. The only other items of note was a small slip of paper with a handwritten message that simply read, quote, "Buy tickets for AS." While the scene investigation continued, detectives began speaking to everyone connected to Teresita, starting with the residents of her apartment building. One resident mentioned seeing Teresita arguing with a man in the hallway about a week before the fire. Another neighbor reported seeing a man knocking on Teresita's apartment door earlier on the day of the murder. With further investigation, both men were identified and brought in for questioning. Each one agreed to take a polygraph test, and both passed with no signs of deception. Their stories held up, and they had solid alibis for the time of the murder. Meanwhile, 2 of Teresita's close friends said they had spoken to her on the afternoon she was killed. One remembered hearing a male voice in the background during their call. The other said that Teresita had briefly stepped away to answer the door, and when she came back, she casually mentioned that a friend had arrived. She never said who it was or whether her friend was a man or a woman. When detectives interviewed her colleagues at Edgewater Hospital, they got variations of the same story. Teresita was a creature of habit. She followed the same routine each day. She left for work at the same time every morning, sat in the same seat in the hospital cafeteria, went to mass every Sunday, and practiced piano every afternoon. She loved to entertain close friends, but she was private. She never let strangers into her home. It was her sanctuary and her safe place, so if someone had been inside her apartment the night she was killed, they believed she must have known them. The other thing they all agreed on was there were no romantic partners, ex-boyfriends, or secret lovers in Teresita's life. She was private and focused on her work and her music. In the days and weeks following Teresita's murder, the case was a top priority, but detectives quickly hit a dead end. The first few days are critical to any murder investigation, but they couldn't follow leads they didn't have. After speaking to everyone and then circling back to interview them again, nothing new had come up. No one suspicious had been seen entering or leaving Teresita's apartment, and none of the fingerprints in the apartment matched anyone unknown to the investigation. Newspapers ran the story, but it was barely more than a few short sentences that didn't generate much public interest. 3 months after the murder, there were no key suspects, no new leads, and the trail was cold. 5 months after Teresita's murder, her mother passed away in her home in Dumaguete. Those closest to her said the grief of her only child's murder had consumed her and she died of a broken heart. Just a couple of weeks after Socorro's passing, detectives received a note about a police report that had a very loose but intriguing connection to their cold case. The report came from a police department on the other side of Chicago and described a complaint made by a Dr. Chua, who said he and his wife had been receiving disturbing phone calls. What caught investigators' attention was that Dr. Chua and his wife Remy both worked at Edgewater Hospital, which was the same hospital where Teresita had worked. Remy just happened to be an inhalation therapist in the very same department as Teresita. It took 2 weeks for the report to make its way to the detectives working Teresita's case. At first, they didn't think much of it. The connection to the murder seemed thin, just a couple who happened to work at the same hospital as the victim. But with no new leads and literally nothing else to go on, one of the detectives decided to follow up just in case. Later that same day, he visited the Chuas at their home. The couple were Filipino immigrants and had settled in Chicago for a better life with more opportunities. The detective introduced himself and shared that he was there to ask them some questions about the threatening phone calls they were receiving. But before he could begin the interview, the doctor asked him a question of his own. He asked, quote, "Do you believe in the occult or in exorcism?" The detective didn't believe in the paranormal or that psychics had any place in a police investigation, but he wasn't about to shut down the first new lead they had in 5 months. So when Dr. Chua nervously asked if he believed in spirits, the detective gave a vague response along the lines of, quote, "There are some things I can't explain," which seemed to put the doctor's mind at ease. And so Dr. Chua began his story. He shared how, on 3 separate occasions, his wife Remy had gone into a trance-like state where she completely disassociated from herself and spoke in a strange voice. What struck him most was the language. Remy spoke to him in Tagalog, but it wasn't the dialect they normally used at home. She also used a distinct Spanish accent, which was something Remy didn't naturally have. The first time it happened, he thought she might be sleep-talking, but when it happened again and then again, he knew something was wrong, or at least something was going on that he couldn't explain. Beyond the strange way Remy spoke, it was the level of detail she gave during those episodes that made Dr. Chua decide to come forward to the police. He was very clear he didn't personally believe in ghosts or spirits, but he told the detective that the voice had given him a name and he felt compelled to share the information, just in case it meant something. During the first episode, when Dr. Chua asked who was possessing his wife, the voice said her name was Teresita Basa. The doctor was vaguely familiar with the murder. He was Filipino and worked at the same hospital, so word had gotten around. And in the lead up to her death, 4 other Filipinos had been murdered in Chicago, so the whole community was on edge. But Dr. Chua didn't know Teresita personally, and he had no connection to her. As for Remy, she had met Teresita when they were both in their orientation week at the hospital, but they never worked together since then. Remy worked the night shift and Teresita worked during the day, so occasionally they passed each other in the hospital hallways but never spoke to each other beyond a simple hello. Dr. Chua confessed that during the first episode, when his wife had spoken like Teresita, he was so shocked by the situation he didn't really know what to say. All he could think to do was to tell the voice to leave his wife alone. But the voice said she needed the doctor's help to convict the killer because he was still free. Dr. Chua refused to engage the voice, and eventually his wife came around with zero recollection of what had happened. That night, the couple received a threatening phone call telling them to keep their mouths shut or they would be next. They didn't know the caller and they didn't know what it was about, but after the events of earlier that day, it scared them. They were already planning to move out of their house in a couple of months, but the next day they put their house on the market and within a few days they had moved. The Chuas thought their weird ordeal was over until a few nights later when the voice came back. That time it was stronger as it begged for Dr. Chua's help. Over the next half hour, his possessed wife gave him a play-by-play account of Teresita's murder. The voice started by saying she was alone in her apartment when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find one of her friends from work at her doorstep. He came into the house and they spoke for a short time before the person knocked her unconscious and stabbed her. Dr. Chua asked if she knew the name of the killer and she said yes. Then he asked if there was any evidence to prove what had happened. She said yes again. But before he could get the name or the details, the voice was gone. When Remy came around, she had no recollection of what had gone on while she was supposedly possessed. When another episode happened again a few days later, Dr. Chua was ready. This time he asked for specifics. What was the name of her killer, and what was the evidence she believed could prove he was responsible? Teresita told the doctor that her killer was Allan Showery, a man she had worked with at the hospital. She also said that when the police tracked him down, they would find him in possession of some jewelry which had been stolen after the murder. One was a pearl ring her mother had bought in Paris, and the other was a piece of polished jade that her father had gifted to her mother. She even detailed that the ring would be on the finger of Allan's wife, and the jade would be in her jewelry box. She also told the doctor her cousins' names and said they would be able to identify the stolen jewelry. When Remy came around the third time, Dr. Chua asked her about Allan Showery. She recognized the name as belonging to an orderly who worked in the respiratory department who called himself Doc. Meanwhile, the couple continued to receive threatening phone calls from the mysterious voice. But now that they had a name from Teresita, they realized that the voice sounded exactly like Allan. For a week after the third episode, Dr. Chua nervously awaited another visit from their murdered ghost, but she never came through again. In the meantime, they decided not to tell anyone about the episodes because it was simply too far-fetched for anyone to believe. At the time, Dr. Chua was awaiting the paperwork which would allow him to practice as a doctor in the States. Coming forward to say his wife had been possessed by a murdered colleague and had given him the name of her killer and details of her death wouldn't look so good on the mental competency test he needed to complete. But after the threatening calls continued, they decided they couldn't hold on to the information any longer. They reported the calls but made no mention of the episodes. They figured if anyone looked into it, they would test the waters first and see whether the officer would take them seriously. Luckily, the detective assigned to Teresita's murder was the one given the task of following up their report. When he heard all that the Chuas had to share, he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Write it off as crazy, investigate the couple for wasting police resources, or actually take a closer look at their claims. He chose the third option. When the detective arrived back at the station, he looked into Allan Showery. A background report showed that he had been arrested for burglary, possession of stolen mail, and theft between 1964 and 1971. Then in 1972, Allan had been arrested twice for sexual assault. Both incidents had occurred inside the victims' apartments. Despite the seriousness of the charges, Allan had never been convicted of any crimes. Allan suddenly looked like a strong lead, but then the detective made another connection. The handwritten note which was found in Teresita's apartment, "Buy tickets for AS." The initials could stand for Allan Showery. It was clear that Teresita and Allan had known each other, but it wasn't clear why his name had not come up in the initial investigation. The detective knew he would need to figure that out sooner or later, but his first priority was to track Allan down and have a chat. That would end up being easier said than done. When detectives spoke to staff at the hospital about Allan, they said they knew him but hadn't thought to mention his name at the time of the murder investigation. They confirmed that Allan knew Teresita and they had been seen talking together at lunch and often caught the bus home together after their shifts. But every address authorities had for Allan was a dead end, and every time they waited at the hospital for him to start his shift, he called in sick or had a day off. Finally, after days of searching, the detectives caught up with Allan after literally walking down the street where someone thought he lived and looking at the names on the doors. His apartment was less than 5 minutes' walk from Teresita's building. It was Allan himself who buzzed the cops into the building. When they said they wanted to talk to him, he cheerfully asked if they were there to talk about Teresita. They confirmed that's exactly what they were there to do, and Allan said he would do anything he could to help. He welcomed them inside his apartment where they found his heavily pregnant wife, Yanka, sitting on the floor surrounded by books about psychic phenomena and ghosts. The detectives asked Allan to come to the station for a chat, and he enthusiastically agreed. On the drive over, the detectives made a point of not saying anything to Allan, but he started talking about Teresita and how she was such a good person and how terrible her murder was. He referred to himself as one of her best friends and repeated that he would do anything he could to help. At the station, he was read his Miranda rights and he agreed to talk without a lawyer present, so the detectives got straight into it. They started by asking Allan his date and place of birth for the record, March 25, 1946 in New York City. Then they asked Allan to share the details of his relationship with Teresita. He said they had met at the hospital and they were very close, in a platonic way. She occasionally invited him over for a beer, but the last time he visited her home was 6 months before her death. Even though the detectives didn't have any evidence to prove otherwise, they put on a good cop, bad cop routine and told Allan his prints were all over the apartment and there was no way it had been 6 months since he'd been there. At that point, Allan confessed that he had caught the bus home with Teresita that day, as they often did. They would usually get off at the same stop and he would walk towards his house while she went in the opposite direction to hers. On that day, however, she mentioned she was having problems with her television set. Allan offered to come and take a look and do what he could to fix it. They walked back to Teresita's home together and he took the back off of the TV and noticed an issue with her wiring. He didn't have any tools with him, so he said he would take the problematic wiring home to fix and return later that evening. At around 6:30 p.m., he left the apartment and walked home. By the time he was done fixing the wiring that night, Allan was tired, so he figured he would go back to Teresita's on another day and put her TV back together. He spent the rest of the evening playing chess with his wife Yanka. He only heard about Teresita's murder and the fire the next day when he was at work, although he did hear the sirens from his apartment when emergency services drove towards the scene that night. After asking a few more questions, the detectives left the room to make a game plan. First of all, they needed to check Allan's alibi for the night of the murder. He said he was with his wife, so they left him in the interview room while they drove back to the apartment to speak to Yanka and get her version of events. Allan's wife said she remembered the night clearly even though it had been more than 6 months prior. She recalled the sound of the sirens as the fire department raced to the scene and that Allan wasn't home yet. He got back from work at around 8 p.m. and then she went out shopping. That night they watched the news and discovered that a woman had died in the fire at the apartment building just around the corner. 2 things stood out about Yanka's statement. First, the time Allan got home didn't match his statement, and neither did his recollection of when he had heard about Teresita's death. So the detectives asked Yanka about Allan working on some wiring that night. She seemed confused and told them she had never seen him working on any kind of wiring ever. Just before they wrapped up the conversation, they asked Yanka if they could take a look at her jewelry and she agreed. Yanka seemed more than happy to help and she agreed to join the detectives at the station with her jewelry box. Before the detectives went back to talk to Allan again, they called one of Teresita's cousins and a close friend to ask if they would come to the station to see if they could identify her jewelry. They both agreed and drove right over. Teresita's friend arrived first. He was led into the room where Yanka was waiting with her jewelry box on the table. The friend immediately asked to speak to the detective alone. In the hallway, he said, quote, "That woman is wearing Teresita's ring, the one her mother bought in Paris." When the investigators asked Yanka about the ring, she said it was a belated Christmas gift from Allan. He had given it to her around the end of February that year. A few minutes later, Teresita's cousin arrived to look at the jewelry. The ring had been put back in the box and he immediately picked it out as well as a piece of jade. He confirmed they both belonged to Teresita. The detectives couldn't quite believe how they had gotten to that point. Had a ghost really identified the killer and the exact location of the 2 pieces of jewelry which had been stolen from her on the night of the murder? When they asked Allan about the jewelry, he told them he bought both items from a street hawker for $28. It was only when they told Allan that Yanka was in the next room and she was giving a different story about that night and the jewelry that he showed any sign of cracking. The detectives told him they knew he wasn't telling the truth and he needed to come clean. To their surprise, that's exactly what he did. Allan admitted that he had gone home with Teresita under the guise of fixing her TV. When he took the back off of the unit, he noticed the wiring was funky, so he told her he needed to fix it at home. He told her it would take a little while and he would come back later once it was done. He went home, and a couple hours later he headed back to Teresita's, but he had no intention of putting her television back together. Allan told the officers that his intention had always been to rob her. He was short on funds and Teresita didn't seem to be in the same position. She would occasionally ask him to run errands for her, and she always paid him generously in cash, and whenever he said he needed help, she would give him money with no questions asked. Allan figured Teresita must have a stash of money hidden somewhere in her apartment, and he wanted in on the action. When she let him in for the second time that night, Teresita was on the phone to a friend. After she hung up and went to lock the front door, Allan grabbed her from behind and put her into a chokehold until she passed out. Then he dumped her on the floor and started going through her things. In her purse he found $30 and he grabbed a handful of jewelry from her dressing table, but aside from that he didn't find anything of much value and certainly no secret stash of cash. With no treasure to take home, Allan decided to cover his tracks and make sure Teresita couldn't identify him. He picked her up from the living room floor and placed her on the floor of the bedroom. Then he undressed her, went into the kitchen and grabbed the knife she had been using to prepare her dinner and stabbed her right through the chest. Teresita had not regained consciousness after the chokehold. Finally, Allan put the mattress on top of Teresita's body, lit it on fire, and left the apartment. The detectives asked Allan if he had sexually assaulted his victim. He said he had posed her naked and with her legs spread so that the cops would think it was a sex crime and go after someone else. He also confessed that he had kept Teresita's ring and the pendant which he gave to his wife. He dumped the other jewelry he stole in a public trash bin. After having Allan retell the story again to check for inconsistencies, the detectives felt confident he was finally telling the truth. The next step was to call the assistant state attorney to take a formal statement. In the meantime, Allan asked to speak to Yanka. He told his wife what he had done and that he wanted her to start a new life without him. He urged her to leave any memory of him behind because he was going away for a long time and she needed to find someone who could take care of her and their child. When the ASA arrived, he spent a considerable amount of time asking Allan questions about his confession. Not about the crime itself, but whether he had been coerced into giving the confession or if his statement had been taken under duress. Allan repeatedly confirmed that he was aware of what he was admitting to, that he was of clear mind, and that he understood his right to remain silent and have legal representation. When that was done, he gave the same story he had given to the detectives. At the end of the interview, Allan was charged with murder, felony murder, armed robbery, and arson. That should have easily put Allan in prison for a long time, but when your star witness is a ghost, things tend to get a little weird. When the news of Allan's arrest was released to the media, the police department said they identified Allan because his initials were on the handwritten note in Teresita's apartment. But when Allan was assigned a defense lawyer, things took a different turn. The lawyer quickly discovered that the case wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Among the documents was the original memo written by the detective who had taken Dr. Chua's statement. The document described how his wife had entered trances and claimed to be possessed by Teresita Basa. The memo confirmed that the entire investigation had been triggered by something that, legally speaking, didn't meet the usual standards for probable cause. Building a murder case based on information supposedly passed on by a ghost wasn't exactly standard police procedure. The defense promptly filed a motion arguing that the entire foundation of Allan's arrest was flawed and therefore any confession he made was inadmissible. They argued that the onus was on the police department to prove Allan had done something illegal to warrant him being taken to the station for questioning in the first place. During the hearing, the prosecution argued that Allan had gone to the station and given a statement willingly and that he hadn't been arrested until after his confession. But Allan testified that he had been forced to go to the station against his will that night, and Yanka corroborated her husband's version of events. The detectives were also called to testify in the hearing. For 5 hours the court heard about Teresita's possession of Remy Chua and the details she had given about the circumstances of the murder, the missing jewelry, and the name of the killer, all which transpired to be accurate. At the end of the hearing, the judge determined there had been no misconduct on behalf of the investigators. It was their duty to explore every lead, no matter where that information came from. It would have been negligent for them to dismiss the Chua's statement, no matter how unbelievable it might have seemed. The judge was satisfied Allan had been informed of his right to remain silent and had understood the implications of giving a statement. The motion to suppress Allan's confession was denied. While the prosecution and the defense prepared to go to trial, detectives continued looking into Allan's background. They re-interviewed Teresita's colleagues from the hospital and discovered that he had been having affairs with multiple women that he worked with. Allan also ran a side hustle selling jewelry to his colleagues, jewelry which was being stolen from patients at the hospital. It was clear why no one had mentioned Allan's name during the initial investigation. His colleagues were either involved in sexual relationships with him or they had purchased jewelry they suspected was stolen. Strangely, several of Teresita's Filipino co-workers shared that since her murder they had experienced things they couldn't explain. Some spoke of unsettling dreams, visions of Teresita in the hallways, or sudden chills when they passed her seat in the cafeteria. They all agreed that it felt like Teresita was trying to tell them something. After Allan was arrested, those strange occurrences stopped. In October of 1978, Allan's trial for murder, armed robbery, and arson got underway in Chicago. The case was covered widely in the media thanks to the fact that a ghost had named the killer. On the stand, Allan's story changed completely from his earlier confession. That time, he denied any involvement in Teresita's death and presented an entirely new version of events. He claimed that on the night of the murder, he and his wife Yonka were at home before heading out to dinner at a friend's house. Yonka backed up his alibi. The defense also pointed out that no fingerprints belonging to Allan were found in Teresita's apartment, and there was no physical evidence linking him directly to the scene of the crime. They argued that the original confession had been made under pressure and that the entire case was built on hearsay and superstition. But the prosecution reminded the jury that Allan had not only confessed, he had also provided details about the crime that had not been made public, like that Teresita hadn't been sexually assaulted. The detectives testified about how the investigation into Allan began after Dr. Chua came forward, claiming his wife had been possessed by Teresita's spirit. That spirit had named Allan as the killer and provided details about the missing jewelry which no one else would have known. The defense never offered an explanation for how Allan had come into possession of Teresita's ring or pendant. After 7 days of evidence and intense courtroom testimony, the jury began deliberations. But after 4 days, they were unable to reach a verdict. 50% of the jury believed Allan was responsible, and the other half believed he was being racially targeted. With a hung jury, the judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. He ordered that Allan continue to be held in custody until they could determine a new trial date. Then, on February 21, 1979, the case took another surprising turn. That night, at nearly the same time that Teresita was stabbed exactly 2 years earlier, Allan made a call to his lawyer. The following morning, he stood before a judge and asked to enter a guilty plea to murder. The judge checked and double-checked that Allan knew what he was admitting to and the consequences of changing his plea. When he was sure that Allan was of sound mind, he accepted the plea. Allan Showery was sentenced to 14 years in prison, but after serving just 4 years, he was released on parole. He never resumed his relationship with Yonka or their child. Obviously, there are many people who are skeptical of the story, but the information given to the authorities by the Chuas was what ultimately solved the case. It's entirely possible they were lying about the possession. Some people believe that Remy had information about the murder but was too scared to come forward, so she gave the info to her husband while pretending to be in a trance. If that's the case, how she got the information is unclear. It's also unknown who was calling their house or if it was connected to the case. No matter what you believe, in a way, Teresita did help solve her own murder. If Remy was too scared to report what she knew, the possession gave her the courage to do so. Sometimes it takes a ghost to catch a monster. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.